Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying what a very great pleasure it is to be with you today. And I apologize, I'm speaking in English. I'm afraid I know no Dutch, so English is what you're getting, I'm afraid. But it is a great pleasure to be able to talk about this theme of the discipleship of the mind. And on the next slide, I put a quote from Matthew's Gospel, which I think sets this in context. On the next slide, thank you. Oh, let me read this to you. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And what I want to do is to set before you a vision of the Christian gospel as something that is transformative, as something that changes the way in which we live, the way in which we think. And in many ways, the challenge I want to lay before you this afternoon is to begin to appreciate the richness of the gospel and the difference that it makes for the way in which we think about things. There's a well-known English author called Evelyn Waugh, and in his reflections on the difference that becoming a Christian made, he wrote about Christianity changing everything. He wrote, "Conversion is like stepping into the real world that God made, and then begins the delicious process of exploring it limitlessly, exploring it." And what I want to suggest to you this afternoon is that all of us need to explore our faith, to reach into its depths, to appreciate its richness, and to begin to understand the way in which it changes the way we think about our disciplines, about the things that we are studying, and about our vision for the future. So I want to challenge you this afternoon. I want to reassure you that Christianity is rich, it's wonderful, it sets before you a vision of reality that should excite you and make you want to go deeper and further in your thinking about faith. Now, the French writer Marcel Proust had a very good quote which I'm going to give you now. He says, "The true voyage of discovery does not consist in searching for new landscapes, but in seeing them with new eyes." But in seeing them with new eyes. And what I want to say to you this afternoon is that Christianity gives us a new way of seeing things. It opens our eyes. It heals our vision. It enables us to see things as they really are. And that's the sense of excitement that I want to bring to our discussion this afternoon. In Romans 12, Paul writes these words, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds." Be transformed by the renewing of your minds. In other words, you do not echo passively what the world thinks. The transforming reality of the Christian faith changes us. It changes the way in which we think. And what I want to do this afternoon is to try and explain to you some of the ways in which this changes the way in which we think, and reflect with you on how you can develop this in your own lives and in your thinking about the future. A way of seeing things. The point I want to make here is that Christianity offers us a big picture. It's a way of making sense of the whole of life, our own experience, the physical world, human culture. All of these are things that are explained, that are given a deeper context by the Christian faith. It gives us a comprehensive way of looking at things, not just changing us, but changing the way in which we think. And I'm going to give you a quote from C.S. Lewis that I've always found enormously helpful in thinking about this. He wrote these words back in 1941. "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." In other words, Lewis is saying that the Christian faith is like a sun that is rising, which illuminates the landscape, which lets us see further, which lets light penetrate into the shadowlands. It's a wonderful vision of what the Christian faith is, and it really plays a major role in our thinking this afternoon. My key argument is that Christianity changes the way we see things, and the way in which we see things affects the way in which we understand them and the way we behave towards them. It's a very biblical idea. It's all about transvaluation. In plain language, about seeing things as they really are, as God sees them, and allowing this to change the way in which we think and behave. Let me give you an example. The example I'm going to give is to do with a school in England. It's a school you'll never have heard of. It's called Canford School in Dorset. And you need to know one thing about this school to make sense of it. The building which became this school in 1920 used to belong to a very prominent British historian and Assyriologist who specialized in the history of Assyria. And he died some years before, and he brought a lot of stuff back from Assyria to his home. When they bought the house, they found an old stone in the building. It was now the school's property. And I don't know if you can see it, but this is what the stone looked like. You can't see. Basically, it's a kind of carving. And this block of stone was a nuisance. It got in everyone's way. They tried to use it to keep the Coke machine straight. Then it became the basis for the school's pizza parlor. And then an expert from the British Museum visited the school and saw this stone and realized what it really was. It was taken from the throne room of an Assyrian king whose name I cannot pronounce, from the 9th century BC. It was a genuine historical artifact, and later that year it sold for $11 million. Now here's the point I want to make. Did the stone change? No. What changed was that people realized what it really was. They used to think this stone is a nuisance of no value. Then they realized what it really was, and they saw it as being valuable. The point I want to make to you is that Christianity enables us to see things, to see ourselves, to see the world, to see history for what it really is. And that seems to me to be enormously important. And I think there are three images or three models that help us to think about this. The first of them is a lens. Think of a camera, a telescope. And what I want you to do is to imagine that you're looking at something through a camera lens and it's out of focus. Everything is blurred, and then someone adjusts the lens and everything comes into focus and you see it clearly. That's what the Christian faith is about. It brings the world into focus. It's like putting on a set of spectacles. It enables you to see things sharply as they really are. So hold that image in your mind, bringing things into focus. The second image is light. And again, remember that quote from C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So imagine the scene that Lewis is inviting you. Imagine there is a beautiful landscape when it is dark and the sun is rising, and gradually you begin to see the hills, the valleys, the rivers, the woods, the villages. It's all there, but the light makes it visible. Christianity is like that. It's about allowing us to see things. It's about allowing us to see further. And it's also about lighting up the shadowlands, the darker side of life that we find so troubling. This is a quote from Simone Weil, a well-known French writer who became a Christian and talked about the difference that her faith made. If I light an electric torch at night, she said, I don't judge its power by looking at the bulb, but by seeing how many objects it lights up. The value of a spiritual way of life is appreciated by the amount of illumination thrown upon the things of this world. And this is one of the reasons that I became a Christian. I used to be an atheist. I have to say I used to be quite an aggressive atheist. In fact, when I read Richard Dawkins, I find myself getting very nostalgic because, I used to be like that. But then I discovered Christianity. And it began to make sense of things. And I realized that here was a way of thinking, a way of looking, a way of seeing that made sense, both of the world around me and also of my own life. That's very important and very precious. And thirdly, it's about a map. Christianity gives us a way of mapping the landscape of reality, letting us know what's there, and we judge the reliability of the map by how well it corresponds to the landscape. The map works. And so I want to reassure you of the intellectual resilience of the Christian faith. I want to reassure you that you can trust it. But I also want to challenge you about what you do about this. And I think the first challenge we face is to understand our faith properly, not resting content with our superficial engagement, a surface reading of things, but wanting to go deeper. The discipleship of the mind is about going deeper into our faith. It's about discovering things, and it's part of our process as growing Christians. It's about becoming wiser. It's about discerning things that we didn't notice before. We need to do it. But I also want to challenge you about something else. I want to reassure each of you here this afternoon that you are special to God. You are important to God. And he wants to do great things through you. Where does he want to take you? What can you do for him? And the point I want to make this afternoon is that for some of you, maybe for most of you, it's about being a Christian witness, a Christian presence in the academic world, maybe in the professional world. In other words, where you are following through on your studies in order to be salt and light in that discipline and serve God in that way. And if you feel that that is right for you, I want to assure you this is a noble calling, it's an important calling, and we really do need people there. Maybe that's you. And what we need to try and do, I think, is bring together our Christian faith on the one hand and our own academic world, sciences, the arts, humanities, whatever, and let these enrich each other. And I want to assure you this will bring a new depth to your faith, but I also want to reassure you it will enable you to connect up with others and help them realize the joy and delight that the Christian faith brings. So let me emphasize this idea of calling. In 1 Peter 2, we read these words, you, that means all of us here this afternoon. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's you. You've been called, first of all, to be Christians, and that is wonderful. But secondly, to live out that Christian life in some specific place, in some specific way, which you know and maybe nobody else does. You may be the person who's able to serve God, to bring God to somewhere or someone very special. Each of us has been called. That is not about being arrogant. It's not about self-importance. It's simply recognizing that this is the way that God sees us. We matter to him. He loves us. He longs to use us, to equip us and lead us to where he wants us to be. Where's that for you? I can't answer that question. What I can say is we need people of your gifts and caliber in the academy, in the professions, where you can live out your Christian faith and be salt and light to those around you. So how do we relate as Christians to the world? And I know many of you are anxious about this. You're worried that engagement with the world might lead to a dilution or a contamination of your faith. But it doesn't have to be like that. There are three main ways of thinking about this. First of all, you can do what we say in English is going with the flow. In other words, everyone else is doing this, I'm doing it too. It just leads to an endorsement of the ideas and values of the world. Or secondly, you can adopt a position which I'm going to call critical appropriation. In other words, there are some things that are good, there are some things that are bad. We need wisdom about how we engage with what's there. Some things good, some things bad, some things neutral, but it's not universal rejection or universal endorsement. And then thirdly, of course, there's turning our backs on the world, walking away from it, rejecting the world as evil, corrupt, or irrelevant. And if we do that, God loses his contacts with that world that so badly needs to be transformed. You and I are called to be salt and light, and those are images of being noticed, of being present in our culture. That's where you need to be, so that God may use you and speak through you. We can live in the world without being of the world. We find this point made very clearly in John chapter 17. We live in the same empirical world as everyone else, but we see it, we value it in very different ways. You can serve God in the world without being dragged down into the world and its values. You can stand out and you can be different. So what I want to do now is encourage you to build a personal vision. In English, the word vision is very, very rich. It's about seeing a big, glorious picture and realizing that you are part of it. And we need to build a vision, first of all, of who God is. A vision of the nature of the gospel, and a vision of our own place in God's scheme of things. They're all important, but this afternoon it's the third we're mainly thinking about. First of all, building a vision of God. And you might think of Isaiah chapter 6. Read it tonight if you don't remember it. This is all about Isaiah hearing God calling him. He goes into the temple and he is overwhelmed by the glory of God. And first of all, that moves him to confess his sins. But then something else happens. He hears God saying, "Who shall we send?" And he says, "Here am I, send me." Grasping that vision of God, realizing who God is and what God is like, impels us to serve God and to want to do more for him. Build that vision of God. It's very often more captured in worship than it is in theology seminars, but it's something that will sustain your faith and animate and excite you and motivate you to want to serve God more. Then we need to think about the gospel itself. What is it? The difference it makes. And certainly we need to reflect on passages like Philippians 3, which talks about regarding everything as loss because of Christ. Paul writes, "I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord." And one of the things we all need to do is renew our vision of what the gospel is, rediscovering the love of God for each of us, rediscovering Christ's death and resurrection for each of us here. It's about rediscovering something that very often we know so well, we take it for granted. We need to pray God to renew our faith and give us a new depth of faith so that we can serve him more effectively. Now those 2 points I've just made are both important. But this afternoon, I want to focus on the third point, building a vision for ourselves. And what I mean by that is trying to understand how we fit into things. What does God want me to do? How has He equipped me? What is He calling me to do for Him in this world and in this very special nation? These are questions we need to ask. And let me emphasize something. Humility is a very important Christian virtue. It means we don't get arrogant. But humility does not mean saying, I am nothing, I am useless, I have no gifts. Because you have, and you know that. And more importantly, God knows that as well. Yes, we need to recognize our weaknesses, but we also need to realize God has given each of us gifts. And these are gifts He's given us, He's entrusted to us, because He wants us to use them and He wants us to serve Him through these gifts. It's important to realize that we're not on our own in leading the Christian life, because God is there as one who loves us, as one who calls us, as one who journeys with us wherever we go. Read again Psalm 23. The emphasis there is that whether we go through good times or bad times, even when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, God is there journeying with us and accompanying us. He's always there, and we draw on His strength. Look at 2 Corinthians 12. Paul heard God speaking words to him, and I think these words are spoken to each of us here this afternoon. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. And you know, I think it's when we realize that we aren't that good, we aren't that strong, that we begin to draw on the wisdom and strength of God, which is there for all of us. So the point I'm making is very simple, but I'm afraid it's also very challenging. What does God want you to do? What gifts has He entrusted you with, which might suggest what you ought to be doing for Him? Maybe your friends know you better than you think, and they might be able to help you identify what these gifts, what these strengths are. And this calling may lead you to be a missionary, it may lead you to all kinds of things. But this afternoon, there is one possibility I want you to think about and take very seriously. That God wants you to be a living presence, a witness in the academy, in the professions. Maybe He's brought you to this point today because this is what He's prepared for you. And it doesn't matter whether we talk about literature, whether it's the natural sciences, whether it is the arts, whether it is law, whether it is theology. We need voices of faith who earn respect in those communities and are able to do two things. Number one, bear witness. Be there. If you don't, we lose a Christian presence. But secondly, You may find that your professional studies give you ways of deepening your own understanding of faith, giving you new ways to express it, new ways to communicate it with your culture. I'm just finishing a biography of C.S. Lewis, a name I think many of you will know. And after his conversion, Lewis wondered, what could I do for God? And as you will know, Lewis's professional field of studies was English language and literature. Yet because he had mastered the art of literature, he was able to write, use analogies, use turns of phrase, which enabled him to communicate far better with his audience than he otherwise might do. So what are you studying? Is that a key to your future? I don't know. But what I do know is this, and listen very carefully. Number one, every single one of you here this afternoon matters profoundly to God. You are special. Christ died for you. You are a jewel in the crown of God. How are you going to live out that special life in a special way? Number two, we do need you to think very seriously about how you relate your Christian faith and your academic discipline. For some of you, the academic discipline is just a passing thing, and you move on to something else. I understand that. But for others, this is where I want to be. This is where I feel I ought to be. And I want to serve God in that situation. If you feel that, I want to say that is precious, it's noble, it's something to be honored and something to be developed. You will need God's strength, but happily that is there in abundance. You will also need to get engaged in that field. Think strategically about what you could do, the difference you can make, and above all, aim for excellence in that field, seeing this as a way in which the gospel can be expressed in this nation. But the final point I want to make is really very simple. It's a point that Paul makes in bringing his first letter to the Thessalonians to a close. And Paul lays out before his readers the challenges they face. Many of them are young Christians, many of them are uncertain about the future, they're wondering what should we be doing, they're thinking big thoughts, and they're uncertain. Not because they don't trust God, but because they aren't quite sure where their faith is going to take them. Paul wrote these words, and I think they are words that speak to all of us this afternoon. He who called you is faithful, and he will do it.